In the deep cold of the Altai Mountains, the dirt holds its secrets tightly. In the year 2008, an excavation team working in the frozen Siberian soil of Denisova Cave sifted through the earth and found a splinter of bone. It was a fragment from the pinky finger of a young girl. It was smaller than a common coin. It looked like nothing. It looked like the kind of debris that history leaves behind and quickly forgets. But this single, solitary fragment was about to break the human family tree. For over a century, the story of human evolution was taught as a clean, linear march, one species naturally replacing the last, a lonely climb toward modern intelligence. Bones were the currency of this timeline. Skulls, jaws, heavy femurs. You needed physical architecture to prove a species existed, but this fragment, known as Denisova 3, did not offer a face or a skeleton. It offered something much more durable. Locked inside that tiny piece of bone, protected by the freezing temperatures of the cave, was an exquisitely preserved chain of mitochondrial DNA. The true weight of the object was not understood until 2 years later. In the year 2010, researchers Johannes Krause and Svante Pääbo, alongside their team at the Max Planck Institute, sequenced the genetic code hidden inside the finger bone. The results did not match Homo sapiens. The sequence did not match Neanderthals. The numbers described a completely unknown hominin lineage, one that had diverged from our shared ancestors roughly 1 million years ago. For the first time in history, an entire human species was identified not by a skull, not by a reconstructed body in a museum display, but purely by the invisible sequences of its biological code. The Denisovans had no face. They had no known shape. They existed strictly as pure information, a ghost written in nucleotides. Yet this ghost did not stay buried in a Siberian cave. When the geneticists looked outward, comparing this newly discovered code to the global population, they found something deeply unsettling. The trace of this faceless species was not dead. It was hiding in the blood of billions of people alive today. This is where the official comforting narrative begins to fracture. Your own DNA contains genes from species that have completely vanished from the physical record. You're carrying the biological memory of creatures that left almost no fossils behind. It forces a terrifying realization. Entire human civilizations, distinct branches of humanity, lived on this planet, thrived, built their own realities, and then were subjected to an erasure so absolute that only their genetic shadows survived to prove they were ever here. We are not the sole actors on an empty stage. The world we inherited was not waiting for us to conquer it. It was crowded. We are merely the leftovers of a much wider multi-species world. We are walking on a graveyard of erased cousins, and modern science is only just now catching up to the secrets locked inside our own bodies. The history we have been taught is too small. The real terrain is vast, and the past is not fully gone. Before we step deeper into this missing layer of history and map the timeline as it actually existed 50,000 years ago, leave a physical trace of your own. Take a moment to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments exactly what location you're watching from. The traces we leave behind matter, and our journey into the forgotten world is just beginning. 50,000 years ago, the Earth was not a lonely planet waiting for us to inherit it. If you could walk across the continents during that narrow window of deep time, you would not find an empty wilderness preparing for the arrival of modern civilization. You would find a world that was already crowded. It was heavily populated by entirely distinct branches of humanity, all breathing the same air, walking the same soil, and looking up at the same stars at exactly the same time. To understand the true scale of this shared world, we have to look at the dry dirt of Morocco. In the year 2017, the paleontologist Jean-Jacques Hublin and his team at the Max Planck Institute pulled fragments of skulls and jaws from a site called Jebel Irhoud. These bones belong to our direct ancestors, Homo sapiens. But the dating of the rock changed everything. The fossils were 300,000 years old. That number is not just a biological milestone in a textbook, it is a massive scale reset. It means our species did not simply arrive at the end of a long empty road. We stepped onto a planetary stage that was already fully occupied, and we shared that stage for hundreds of thousands of years. The combined weight of the fossil and genetic records describes a world where at least 7 distinct human species coexisted. The timeline is not a theory, it is a physical map. There were Homo sapiens slowly expanding across the land masses. There were the Neanderthals, heavy-boned and resilient, dominating the cold, deep valleys of Europe and Western Asia. There were the Denisovans, spreading from the Siberian mountains all the way to the freezing, thin-air altitudes of the Tibetan Plateau. On the isolated tropical islands of Southeast Asia, the rules of biology warped entirely. They produced Homo floresiensis and a second, completely separate dwarf species known as Homo luzonensis. Deep within the dark, winding cave systems of South Africa, there was Homo naledi. And somewhere in the dense equatorial forests, leaving traces we're only just beginning to decipher, there was a seventh, unnamed ghost species. For generations, the official textbooks presented evolutionary history as a single orderly march. They drew a straight, comforting line of progress, where each primitive ancestor gracefully stepped aside to make room for the next, culminating inevitably in us. The physical reality of the Pleistocene epoch shatters that clean narrative into pieces. The Earth was an incredibly diverse, chaotic laboratory of human existence. We did not evolve to replace our cousins in a neat, predetermined sequence. We lived right alongside them. We shared the same river valleys, we hunted the same giant megafauna, and we carved out our survival in the exact same environments. But that wonder carries a heavy, accumulating pressure. Because when you look at the planet today, the diversity is gone. Out of those 7 distinct ways to exist as a human being, 6 of them were systematically erased. The human family tree was not merely trimmed by the slow mechanics of natural selection. It was violently pruned. Entire lineages that survived ice ages, supervolcanoes, and apex predators were completely deleted from the physical world, leaving almost nothing behind but silence in the rock. The clean timeline we were taught is an illusion covering a massive planetary erasure. We were never alone. For the vast majority of our existence, we were merely one option among many, and not necessarily the strongest, the smartest, or the most impressive one. The central question of our history is not how we evolved from apes. The real, terrifying mystery is why, out of all those thriving, intelligent branches of humanity, we are the absolute only ones left standing in the ruins. The search for that answer begins with the most impossible species on that list. Every other human branch left behind at least a fragment of a skull, a shattered tooth, or a heavy femur buried in the dirt. But there is one archaic species that left absolutely zero physical trace. They vanished so completely that the Earth itself seems to have dissolved their remains. Yet they are not entirely gone, because their genetic shadow is still hiding, written directly into the DNA of modern West African populations. Up to 19% of the genetic code in the modern Yoruba and Mende populations of West Africa does not belong to Homo sapiens. It is a sequence that simply does not fit our timeline. To understand what that 19% actually means, we have to translate genomic data back into physical reality. Genetic introgression is not just a clinical anomaly blinking on a laboratory screen. It is the biological proof of a physical encounter. It means that an unknown human species walked out of the deep past, lived alongside our ancestors, and interbred with them. They shared the same territory, they shared the harsh realities of survival, and they left children behind. Those children carried the physical memory of their parents forward in their blood, passing it down generation after generation, carrying the code deep into the present day, long after the original species was entirely gone. In the year 2020, researchers Arundhava Vasula and Sriram Sankararaman at UCLA published a genomic analysis that finally mapped the edges of this shadow. Their data revealed a distinct lineage of humanity, one that diverged from our own specific family tree roughly 625,000 years ago. This was not a minor offshoot. This was a deep, ancient branch of the human family, separating hundreds of thousands of years before Homo sapiens even existed as a concept, evolving on its own parallel track. And this is exactly where the clean textbook version of human history begins to collapse under its own weight. 19% is a massive biological footprint. A genetic contribution of that size requires a thriving, stable population. It requires thousands of individuals living, hunting, and dying over tens of thousands of years. But if you search the physical record for them, you will find absolutely nothing. There is no jawbone sitting in a museum drawer. There is no shattered skull. There is not a single fragment of a femur or a primitive stone tool or the charcoal stain of a forgotten hearth. The archaeological record for this specific species is completely, terrifyingly silent. This total absence forces a realization that makes the official story feel dangerously fragile. An entire branch of humanity can rule a landscape, shape the biological destiny of millions of modern people, and then be completely deleted from the geological record. The Earth can swallow a species so thoroughly that the only proof they were ever here is the tangled genetic code they left inside the bodies of the survivors. Because of this total physical erasure, science cannot give this ghost species a proper name. No museum can reconstruct their face in clay or silicone. No artist can draw how they moved, or what their eyes looked like, or how they treated their sick, or the way they buried their dead. They exist purely as a mathematical pattern woven into living blood. It is a stark, undeniable reminder that the physical record we trust so much is dangerously incomplete. If an entire human lineage can vanish without leaving a single bone, then the official map of the past is little more than a comforting illusion. But before we can trace these genetic ghosts further, and before we can understand what ultimately wiped them out, we have to understand the physical stage upon which all of these erased species lived. The world they walked across was not the world we know today. It was an entirely different planet. To find out what killed them, we first have to rebuild the massive lost ecosystem that they all shared. A sweeping engineered landscape ruled by giants, stretching endlessly under a colder sun. We leave the invisible code of genetic ghosts behind and step back into the physical wind and tall grass of the Pleistocene epoch. To understand what killed these 6 human species, we must first look at the physical stage where they lived, hunted, and died. It was called the Mammoth Steppe. At its peak, it was the largest single biome on Earth. It was an empire of grass that defined the planet for millions of years. When we imagine the Ice Age, we are usually taught to picture a barren, frozen wasteland. We imagine a dead, white expanse where survival was barely possible, a world buried under deep snow where nothing thrived. But the physical evidence pulled from the dirt describes something entirely different. The Mammoth Steppe was not a frozen, empty tundra. It was a windswept, dry grassland, stretching in one unbroken, continuous line from the Iberian Peninsula in Spain, all the way across Europe and Asia to the Yukon Territory in Canada. From coast to coast, it was a single, thriving ecosystem, and it was teeming with heavy life. In his definitive 1990 work, Frozen Fauna of the Mammoth Steppe, the researcher R. Dale Guthrie mapped the true scale of this vanished world. It was a landscape ruled entirely by giants. The grass supported vast herds of woolly mammoths and steppe bison numbering in the millions. They shared the plains with the woolly rhinoceros, with cave lions twice the weight of modern African lions, and with giant Irish elk carrying antlers that spanned over 3.5 metres across. These animals were not simply passengers grazing passively on the landscape. They were the biological engineers who built it. The endless trampling of millions of heavy hooves crushed the winter snow, letting the deep cold preserve the permafrost while exposing the dry grass to the sun. Their continuous grazing pruned the vegetation, and their dung recycled vital nutrients back into the soil at a massive scale. This biological engine prevented dense forests and insulating moss from creeping in. The animals maintained the grassland in a perfect self-sustaining cycle. For a long time, the official story suggested a simple progression. The theory was that when the climate eventually shifted, the Mammoth Steppe vanished, and because the grass was gone, the megafauna starved. But the geological record points to a much stranger reality. The climate did not betray the animals were the environment. When the megafauna began to disappear, their biological engine stopped. Without the heavy hooves to trample the moss, the ground turned to marsh. The forests encroached and choked out the plains. The disappearance of the megafauna did not follow the collapse of the ecosystem. The disappearance of the megafauna caused the collapse. Every human species on Earth, including our own, evolved inside this massive biological structure. The Mammoth Steppe was not just background scenery. It was the absolute centre of their existence. It was the living cathedral in which our ancestors learned how to survive. The world we inherited today is not a natural default state of the Earth. We are walking on the overgrown ruins of a landscape built by creatures we lost. Understanding what happened to our erased cousins means understanding exactly how their world was broken. And this is not just a theory buried in old academic textbooks. Far to the north, in a remote freezing corner of modern Siberia, there is living proof. Out in the deep permafrost of Yakutia, one scientist is trying to bring the mammoth steppe back to life, proving exactly how this lost world functioned, and showing us exactly what it takes to resurrect the past. In 1996, a Russian scientist named Sergei Zimov fenced off a section of the Siberian tundra. He did not build a traditional laboratory with microscopes and sterile white walls. He brought in heavy hooves. He travelled out to the deep permafrost of Yakutia and released herds of bison, wild horses and musk oxen into the freezing empty landscape. It was the beginning of an ongoing experiment known as Pleistocene Park. The premise was deceptively simple. He wanted to see if the animals could remember how to build a world. The modern tundra is a suffocating environment. It is a thick, fragile blanket of dark moss, small shrubs, and wetlands. This spongy layer insulates the ground, keeping the deep earth dangerously warm in the summer. But when Zimov introduced the large herbivores, the physical shape of the landscape began to change immediately. The animals went to work. They trampled the thick, insulating moss into the dirt. They scraped and compacted the deep winter snow while searching for buried forage. This simple, mechanical movement changed the thermal dynamics of the soil. The compacted snow lost its insulating power. The brutal, freezing winter air was finally able to penetrate deep into the earth. The permafrost stabilized. The invasive shrubs were crushed under thousands of pounds of pressure, and within a few short years the dark moss was replaced by pale, deep-rooted grasses. The hooves were terraforming the earth. Zimov was watching a physical resurrection. The animals successfully recreated local ecological conditions that had vanished 12,000 years ago. The experiment was not just a scientific curiosity. It was a time machine made of muscle and bone. This living data directly confirmed R. Dale Guthrie's historical baseline of the mammoth steppe. The science of the past and the physical reality of the present aligned perfectly. The grass did not passively support the massive herds. The massive herds actively grew the grass. This realization forces a profound shift in how we view the history of the Earth. The mammoth steppe, the largest single biome to ever exist on this planet, was not a natural occurrence. It was not simply a passive byproduct of Ice Age weather. It was an active, continuous biological construct. The ecosystem was engineered by the massive wandering bodies of its inhabitants. They were the absolute architects of their own continent. Their grazing, their dung, and their sheer physical weight maintained the delicate balance of a world that stretched completely unbroken from Spain to Canada. When the climate shifted and human hunters arrived, the historical balance broke. Removing the megafauna did not just extinguish a collection of individual species. It destroyed the engine of the environment. Without the heavy hooves to trample the moss, the grass suffocated. The permafrost warmed. The landscape dissolved into the boggy tundra we know today. The extinction of the animals collapsed an entire planetary biome. We are taught to look at the vast empty forests and frozen plains of the modern North as pristine wilderness. They are not. They are a disrupted environment. They are an overgrown graveyard. We're walking on the ruins of a terraformed planet, and the original architects are dead. Every single human species we have discussed evolved inside this engineered megastructure. The mammoth steppe was their stage, their hunting ground, and their home. They lived in the shadows of these giant ecosystem engineers, and they were watching them closely. The ancient humans who lived alongside these mega-architects knew exactly what they were looking at. They understood the terrifying power of the animals that shaped their world, and they recorded that power. Far away from the Siberian ice, the proof of that observation was left behind. It was not buried in the permafrost, but hidden in the dark, silent depths of a limestone cave in southern France. We leave the freezing winds of the Siberian permafrost behind, descending into the dark limestone silence of southern France. In December 1994, 3 cavers named Jean-Marie Chauvet, Eliette Brunel, and Christian Hilaire squeezed through a narrow hidden passage in the Ardèche Gorge. Their headlamps cut through the absolute suffocating black, and when the light finally hit the underground walls, they found themselves staring directly into the faces of the Pleistocene epoch. The charcoal lines on the pale stone were drawn with such absolute confidence that they still looked wet to the touch. The shading was thick, deliberate, and masterful. In a single glance against the rock, the vast, incomprehensible distance of 36 millennia simply vanished. The people who made these marks were not the primitive caricatures of old museum dioramas. They were highly skilled, meticulous observers. Across the massive limestone panels, the cavers found a perfectly preserved breathing menagerie of the mammoth steppe. There were heavy woolly rhinoceroses locking horns in fierce combat. There were pride-hunting cave lions, easily twice the size of modern African lions, sprinting forward in perfect unison. There were giant mammoths, drawn with the distinct sloping shoulders that only a living, breathing witness could accurately capture in the dark. This was not human imagination running wild in the shadows. This was high-fidelity eyewitness testimony. The artist who stood in this cavern did not invent these animals from scattered fragments of bone. They shared the very same freezing ecosystem. They listened to the heavy footfalls outside the cave entrance. They watched the breath of the cave lions turn to steam in the bitter winter air. Then they retreated into the safety of the earth, mixed their raw pigments, and recorded exactly what they saw. But to look at the walls of Chauvet Cave today is to look at a beautifully rendered graveyard. Every single megafauna species depicted on those sprawling panels is now completely gone from the earth. The woolly rhinoceros is dead. The mammoth is dead. The European cave lion is dead. The ancient artist was not just capturing the daily majesty of the local wildlife, they were inadvertently recording a world that was entirely doomed. These paintings stand as the ultimate proof of our intimate proximity to the giants. They prove that ancient humans did not just survive alongside the massive ecosystem engineers of the Pleistocene. They studied them. They revered them. Chauvet Cave is a perfectly sealed time capsule of a rich biological world, standing completely unaware on the absolute brink of total erasure. The intelligence required to observe, memorize, and translate a living ecosystem into permanent charcoal art is profound. For decades, the official academic timeline insisted that this level of abstract symbolic thought belonged exclusively to Homo sapiens. We were supposed to be the only ones capable of true art. We were the only ones who possessed the cognitive spark. But that comforting illusion was about to be shattered by an even older piece of stone. Because the deepest, most astonishing secret of human history is not what was painted in the dark. It is who was actually holding the charcoal. What if the oldest art in Europe was not made by our species at all? To answer that question, we have to look not at the paint itself, but at the stone growing over it. Deep inside the cave of La Pasiega in Spain, there are strange geometric red pigments applied strictly to the limestone walls. For tens of thousands of years, heavily mineralized water dripped down the rock face, slowly forming a translucent crust directly over the ancient paint. This geological seal is called flowstone, and it acts as a perfect, undisturbed time capsule. In the year 2018, a researcher named Dirk Hoffman and his team applied a technique known as uranium-thorium dating to measure the exact age of this mineral layer. The method does not rely on archaeological guesswork or stylistic interpretation. It calculates the decay of radioactive isotopes trapped inside the rock. It provides a hard mathematical limit, locking in a minimum age for the art. The logic is absolute. If the crust on top of the pigment is a certain age, the paint trapped beneath it must be older. When Hoffman published his results in the journal Science, the final number broke the established timeline of human history. The flowstone crust was at least 64,800 years old. Homo sapiens did not arrive in Europe until roughly 45,000 years ago. That leaves a massive, undeniable gap of 20,000 years. There was only one human species living in the Iberian Peninsula when those marks were made. The artists were Neanderthals, and this was not an isolated anomaly. The exact same results came back from two other Spanish caves, Maltravieso and Ardales. The art was widespread, deliberate, and entirely non-human. For over a century, the official academic narrative cast Neanderthals as primitive evolutionary dead ends. They were written into our textbooks as dim-witted brutes, creatures of pure survival who were entirely incapable of creative expression or complex thought. Art, symbolism, and the cognitive spark were fiercely guarded as uniquely belonging to us. But that clean, comforting narrative cannot survive the mathematics of uranium-thorium dating. The number 64,800 is not a subjective theory. It is a physical, undeniable measurement. Someone who was not us stood in the absolute dark of a cave. They gathered minerals from the earth. They deliberately mixed red pigment. They carried fire into the black depths of the mountain, and they pressed their hands to the stone to leave a symbolic mark. a mark that would outlast their entire species by 60 millennia. They were not mimicking Homo sapiens. We were not even on the continent to be copied. The art was entirely their own. In a single moment of geological dating, the assumed cognitive gap between us and them completely collapses. We do not hold a monopoly on abstract thought. The desire to make a permanent mark on the world, to leave a trace of consciousness behind in the dark, is not uniquely ours. This level of symbolic cognition may have emerged independently, multiple times in entirely separate human lineages, or perhaps it goes back even deeper into the dark, inherited from a shared ancient root long before our evolutionary branches ever split. The Neanderthals possessed the mind of an artist. They had a rich internal world that they projected onto the limestone walls. But the evidence of their intelligence does not stop at visual symbols. If they could think in abstract terms, and if they could paint their reality, the next question changes everything we thought we knew about them. We must move from the painted silence of the caves and look directly at the biological hardware of a voice. In the year 2007, a team of researchers led by Johannes Kraus and Svante Perbo at the Max Planck Institute began searching for that exact hardware. They extracted ancient DNA from Neanderthal remains found deep inside El Sidrón cave in northern Spain. They were not looking for heavy skulls or shattered femurs. They were looking for the invisible instructions that build a human being. What they found in the sequencing data was a highly specific genetic marker known as the FOXP2 gene. In modern humans, this exact gene variant is the direct biological link to speech and language production. It is the genetic software required to coordinate the incredibly complex muscle movements of the mouth and vocal cords. The sequencing from El Sidrón proved that the Neanderthals carried the exact same variant. They possessed the biological code required for language, but a gene is merely a blueprint. To actually speak, a body needs the physical machinery to project sound into the air. Decades earlier, in the year 1989, a researcher named Baruch Arensberg found that exact machinery. He discovered a delicate piece of anatomy belonging to a Neanderthal specimen known as Kebara II, excavated from a cave in Israel. It was a hyoid bone. This is the small, fragile anchor in the throat that supports the base of the tongue and the larynx. It is the physical foundation of the human voice. Because it is not attached to the rest of the skeleton, a hyoid bone is almost never preserved in the fossil record. But the bone from Kebara II survived, and it was not primitive. It was morphologically identical to the one sitting inside your own throat right now. With this discovery, the two most critical pieces of the puzzle aligned. The genetic software discovered in Spain perfectly matched the physical hardware excavated in Israel. The biological architecture for language was completely intact across the Neanderthal world. For generations, the official academic story told us that these people communicated in simple, animalistic grunts. They were cast as dim-witted brutes incapable of complex thought. But the converging evidence described something entirely different. They were biologically equipped for speech. They had the physical capacity to articulate distinct sounds. This realization changes how we must view the ancient world. It means the artists standing in the flickering firelight of those limestone caves likely had specific names for the woolly rhinoceros and the cave lions they painted. They had words to describe the mixing of red pigment, the changing of the seasons and the movement of the ice. They were biologically capable of sharing information, and perhaps even telling stories passed down through the freezing generations of the Pleistocene. But words do not fossilize. Sound leaves no trace in the sedimentary layers of the earth. We are left with the complete biological architecture of a speaking people, but absolutely no recording of what they actually said. The specific language of the Neanderthals is lost to deep time. It was swallowed completely by the silence of their extinction. Yet the story of these speaking, painting people does not end with their disappearance. The evidence locked in our own biology proves that they did not just live in parallel to our ancestors. They did not just share the mammoth step from a safe, isolated distance. As the timeline of the ancient world advanced, the people who painted the caves crossed paths with Homo sapiens. And when they met, the Neanderthals did not merely live alongside us. They moved inside us. The realization that they moved inside us changes the entire architecture of the human story. For over a century, the academic consensus insisted that when Homo sapiens expanded outward, they simply replaced the primitive creatures they encountered. It was supposed to be a clean, ruthless extinction. but the biological record refuses to support that clean timeline. In the year 2010, a team at the Max Planck Institute, led by Richard Green and Svante Pääbo, published a draft sequence of the Neanderthal genome. The results destroyed the old replacement theory overnight. The sequencing proved that 1 to 4% of the genetic code in every living person of non-African descent comes directly from Neanderthals. 1 to 4% might sound like a cold, abstract statistic on a laboratory screen, but in the reality of blood and biology, it is the undeniable fingerprint of family. It means that tens of thousands of years ago, an ancient Homo sapiens and a Neanderthal looked at each other across the fire. They recognized something fundamentally human in one another. They survived the brutal conditions of the Pleistocene epoch together, and they raised children. Those children carried a blended code, passing it forward through deep time. And as the scientific tools grew sharper, the evidence of this merging grew even stronger. In a deep cave in Romania, explorers found a massive, heavy jawbone. It is known today as OAS-1, and it belonged to a human who walked the Earth approximately 40,000 years ago. In the year 2015, geneticist Xiaomei Fu and her team sequenced the ancient DNA locked inside this bone. What they found was staggering. Between 6 and 9% of the DNA in this single individual was purely Neanderthal. That percentage is massive. It is not a distant, diluted echo. It means that the person who left their jawbone in that Romanian cave had a fully Neanderthal ancestor just 4 to 6 generations back. They had a Neanderthal great-great-great-grandparent. This level of genetic saturation proves that this was not a rare, isolated accident, or a brief overlap in a forgotten valley. A genetic signature running this deep requires a sustained, deliberate pattern of interbreeding across thousands of years. The two species did not just compete for resources on the mammoth steppe. They shared camps, they shared fires, they merged their bloodlines over and over again. This realization completely upends the official map of the past. The Neanderthals, the people we were taught went completely extinct, never truly vanished from the Earth. They are currently threaded into the living biology of billions of people. They are in your hair, your skin, and the immune responses of your own body. The species that painted the oldest art in Europe is still walking the streets of our modern cities. Their extinction was not a total, absolute erasure. It was a biological merger. When the climate shifted and the pressures of the ancient world became too heavy, they did not just die out in the cold. They folded their genetic legacy entirely into their replacements. They survived the end of their physical world by quietly becoming a permanent part of ours. But if the map of the human genome can prove that the Neanderthals never fully died out, a terrifying new question begins to form. What else is that genome concealing? If we can find the genetic shadow of a species we already knew about, what happens when the DNA points to something that has no face at all? To answer that, we have to look past the painted caves of Europe. We have to go all the way back to a freezing mountain in Siberia, back to the year 2008, and the single, tiny splinter of bone that started this entire investigation. The realization that extinct human species survived by quietly moving inside our own ancestors forces us to look back at the very beginning of this investigation. We have to return to the freezing heights of the Altai Mountains in Siberia. When paleontologists hunt for lost human branches, they usually look for heavy, recognizable fossils. They search for thick skulls, heavy femurs, or distinct jawbones that can be reconstructed and displayed behind museum glass. They look for a face, but the Denisovans had no face. They had no reconstructed body. They were identified from a single child's finger bone, a fragment smaller than a coin, excavated in the year 2008. 2 years later, in 2010, a team led by Johannes Krauss and David Reich managed to extract and sequence its entire nuclear genome. In doing so, they achieved something deeply unsettling and entirely unprecedented. They defined a massive unknown human species not through physical morphology, but entirely through invisible biological code. The nuclear genome proved definitively that the Denisovans were a distinct and separate branch of the human family tree. But the genetic code did not simply define who they were. It revealed exactly where they went. When David Reich and his colleagues compared the newly mapped Denisovan genome to the DNA of living people across the globe, they found a massive genetic overlap. Modern Melanesian populations, people living today, carry between 4 and 6% Denisovan DNA in their cells. Let the sheer geography of that fact settle in for a moment. Denisova Cave is located in the freezing remote mountains of deep Siberia. Melanesia is a string of tropical islands floating far out in the South Pacific Ocean. The physical distance between the two locations is thousands upon thousands of miles. It crosses massive mountain ranges, vast plains, dense jungles, and open ocean. That staggering distance proves that the Denisovans were not just a small, localized tribe huddled around a fire in one lonely cave. They were an invisible, continental presence. They were a vast, highly successful human population that lived, thrived, and expanded across the massive expanse of Asia for hundreds of thousands of years. They existed on a scale that rivals our own modern footprint. Yet, for all that time, and all that territory, they exist to us today as pure genetic information. They are ghosts written in nucleotides. The clean official timeline of human history, the one printed confidently in textbooks for decades, was completely upended. And it was not broken by a monumental archaeological dig. It was not rewritten by a perfect, intact skeleton pulled from the ice. It was shattered by a single splinter of bone, forgotten in the dirt. It forces a terrifying realization about the ground beneath our feet. An entire continental branch of humanity was discovered entirely by accident. If a species that spanned from the Russian tundra to the Pacific Ocean can be reduced to a single piece of a finger, what else have we missed? But the Denisovans did not just fade into abstract data. The ghost DNA they left behind is not a silent, dormant relic of the deep past. It is highly active. It is operating right now inside the biology of millions of living people, and in one specific extreme region of the world, that extinct code provides a tangible physical trait. It is a biological gift from the dead, and it is exactly what allows those living people to survive their environment today. We are used to discovering our ancestors through the heavy weight of stone and bone. Paleontology is notoriously built on skulls, teeth, and femurs that can be held in a human hand and placed carefully behind museum glass. But the Denisovans broke every rule of that science. For nearly a decade, they existed purely as a ghost in the machine. They were a vast branch of the human family tree with no face and no reconstructed body. They were known entirely through sequences of biological code, extracted from a single splinter of bone in Siberia. But that code was not just a dead archive of the deep past, it was a functional blueprint. And to understand what that blueprint actually does, we have to look at the physical limits of the human body in one of the most hostile environments on Earth. When a typical human body ascends past 4,000 meters, the biology begins to fundamentally fail. The air becomes dangerously thin, and the body panics. To compensate for the severe lack of oxygen, the respiratory system goes into overdrive, overproducing red blood cells at a rapid pace. The blood physically thickens. It turns into a heavy sludge that strains the heart, damages the lungs, and leads to a condition that can easily become fatal. Extreme altitude is a natural, invisible barrier that should keep human populations out. It is a death zone for standard human biology. Yet, on the Tibetan Plateau, millions of people live their entire lives above this exact threshold, without suffering these deadly effects. They breathe easily at the roof of the world. The mechanism behind this survival is a specific variant of a gene called EPAS1. This gene acts as a biological regulator. It strictly controls hemoglobin production, preventing the blood from thickening even when oxygen drops to critical levels. For years, the origin of this flawless adaptation was a scientific mystery. Then, in the year 2014, a researcher named Emilia Huerta Sanchez and her team published a study comparing this exact gene variant to the ancient DNA record. The sequence keeping Tibetans alive did not evolve slowly over thousands of years of exposure. It was a perfect direct match for the Denisovan genome. This specific genetic sequence is virtually absent in Han Chinese populations, living just a few hundred kilometers away at lower elevations. It is a highly concentrated, localized inheritance. The ghost DNA left behind by this faceless species is not just a passive marker of ancient interbreeding. It is a living, breathing piece of biological hardware. It operates inside the cells of modern people every single day, quietly regulating oxygen in the blood. This genetic transfer forces a massive shift in how we understand the lost world. You do not evolve an extreme high-altitude adaptation by sitting in a low valley. If the Denisovans possess the EPAS1 variant, it means they were not just a marginal population huddled in one Siberian cave. They must have been high-altitude dwellers themselves. They must have thrived on the freezing, oxygen-deprived plateaus of Asia for tens of thousands of years, long before our own ancestors ever arrived. The clean, linear story of human evolution tells us that the other species failed, that they were biological dead ends who simply faded away. But the EPAS1 gene proves otherwise. The extinct human species are not entirely gone. They left behind a biological gift, a vanished people, a species we cannot even draw a picture of, provided the exact physiological tool that keeps millions of people alive today. For 9 years, the Denisovan presence on the Tibetan Plateau was visible only in this genetic shadow. The code proved they had to have been there, but the physical Earth refused to yield a single bone. That silence lasted until the year 2019, when a Buddhist monk stepped into a limestone cave, and the ice finally gave the Denisovans a face. In the year 1980, a Buddhist monk stepped into the freezing shadows of Baishiakas Cave, situated high on the Tibetan Plateau. He was not looking for lost human branches, but he found something heavy resting in the dirt. It was a partial jawbone, thick and primitive, carrying massive teeth. For decades, this strange fossil, now known as the Xiahi mandible, sat quietly in a university collection. It was an artifact without a clear context, waiting patiently for technology to catch up to the secret locked inside its mineralized surface. By the time scientists returned their attention to the jawbone, the delicate double helix of its genetic code had degraded. The fossil was simply too old, and the environment too harsh, for traditional DNA sequencing to work. But bones hold another kind of biological memory, one that is far more durable than DNA. Ancient proteins, specifically collagen, are built tough. They can survive deep time, preserving the chemical signature of the creature that built them long after the genetic code has dissolved. In the year 2019, a team led by Fahu Chen pushed this technology to its limit, extracting those surviving proteins from the Xiahi mandible. The structural analysis was undeniable. The jawbone belonged to a Denisovan, and the dating placed it at least 160,000 years ago. It was the absolute physical proof that this vanished species had lived, breathed, and thrived at an extreme altitude of over 3,200 meters. This single piece of bone broke the map wide open. Suddenly, the Denisovans were no longer a marginal population huddled in a single Siberian cave. The geographical distance between Denisova Cave and the Tibetan Plateau is massive. The evidence now described a continental species. They ranged across thousands of kilometers of Asia, adapting to freezing lowlands and suffocating high-altitude plateaus. They were everywhere. And because they were everywhere, they were bound to run into someone else. The proof of that encounter is perhaps the most intimate discovery in the history of human evolution. In the year 2018, a researcher named Vivian Slon and her team at the Max Planck Institute sequenced a tiny, unrecognizable fragment of bone. It was found back in Denisova Cave, a piece of debris designated as Denisova 11. When the sequencing finished, the results seemed impossible. The bone belonged to a teenage girl. Her mother was a Neanderthal. Her father was a Denisovan. She was a first-generation hybrid, a child born directly from the union of two distinct human species. Her existence was not a mathematical abstraction, extrapolated from population data. It was flesh and blood. The girl, affectionately known as Denny, proves that the ancient world did not care about our rigid, academic classifications. We use the word species to draw clean lines between different branches of life, but the biology shows that those lines were an illusion. When the Neanderthals and the Denisovans met across the vast, freezing expanses of the Pleistocene continent, they did not just coexist in silent parallel. They shared fires, they shared shelter, they met, they merged, and they had children. They were family. The vast, unbroken geography of the Eurasian continent allowed these colossal human populations to wander, to intersect, and to blend their biology over hundreds of thousands of years. But what happens when that geography is broken? What happens to a human lineage when it's trapped, cut off from the rest of the world and forced to survive on a small, isolated patch of land? To find out, we have to leave the freezing continental plateaus. We must turn our attention southward, moving into the bizarre alien evolutionary laboratories of the deep ocean. The traditional textbook image of human progress is a comfortable, carefully curated lie. We are taught to visualize a straight ascending line of inevitable improvement. We picture ancient apes slowly standing upright, stepping out of the forest, growing steadily taller, and developing larger brains with every passing epoch. We assume that human evolution only moves in one direction, pointing directly toward us. But when a biological lineage is cut off from the massive continental plateaus, that clean, linear narrative completely collapses. When large mammals are suddenly trapped on remote oceanic islands, the environment enforces a brutal new mathematical logic. Space is finite, calories are severely limited. The animals that survive are not the strongest, but the ones that require the least amount of energy to exist. Over hundreds of thousands of years, the island forces large creatures to shrink, compressing their biology. This mechanism is known as island dwarfism, and for a long time, the academic establishment believed it only happened to animals. That belief ended in the year 2004. A research team led by Peter Brown and Mike Morwood was excavating the deep sediment of Liangbua Cave, located on the remote Indonesian island of Flores. Deep beneath the surface, they uncovered a skeleton that shattered the human family tree. The specimen is formally designated as LB1. It was not a child. It was a fully grown, mature adult female, but she stood roughly 1 meter tall, and when the researchers measured her cranial capacity, they found a brain volume of exactly 380 cubic centimeters. To put that specific number into perspective, 380 cubic centimeters is roughly the brain capacity of a modern chimpanzee. According to the traditional timeline, a brain that's small should belong to a primitive creature that barely knew how to hold a broken branch. But the dirt in Liangbua Cave told a deeply contradictory story. Buried in the exact same geological layers as the tiny skeleton were sophisticated flaked stone tools. The archaeological record around the bones showed clear, undeniable evidence of cooperative hunting, fire use, and deliberate meat processing. For years, a vocal minority of critics desperately tried to explain this away. They argued that LB1 was simply a diseased Homo sapiens. They claimed she was a modern human suffering from a rare pathological growth disorder. It was an attempt to force the evidence back into a safe, familiar box. But as more fragmented individuals were found, the physical anatomy refused to cooperate. The skeleton possessed primitive wrist bones, a distinct jaw, and a shoulder structure resembling ancient hominins that had vanished from Africa 2 million years earlier. This was not a deformed modern human. This was a distinct, highly adapted, previously unknown branch of humanity. This was Homo floresiensis. The existence of the Flores people proved that intelligence and survival are not strictly tied to massive brain volume. Evolution did not just march forward in a straight line, inevitably leading to us. On this island, evolution ran backward in physical size. It pulled primitive anatomical traits out of the deep past, while perfectly maintaining human intellect and ingenuity. It broke every single assumption we ever had about what it actually takes to be human. But Homo floresiensis did not survive in a vacuum. The island of Flores was not an empty, quiet paradise. The exact same evolutionary forces that shrank these ancient humans to the size of young children were simultaneously warping the rest of the local food web. The tiny humans shared their isolated world with an ecosystem that operated on inverted, terrifying rules. The true mystery is not just how small these humans became, it is the absolute nightmare of giant predators and bizarre prey they were forced to face in the dark. The Pleistocene island of Flores reads like a fever dream of human prehistory. It was a closed, humid expanse of dense jungle, where the standard rules of mammalian scaling were completely rewritten. In the deep, unbroken isolation of the ocean, evolution enforces a strange and lethal inverted logic. Mammals that require massive amounts of calories to survive are severely penalized by the island limits, and so, over hundreds of millennia, the ancestors of elephants that had somehow washed ashore began to physically shrink. They became a miniature species, scaling down generation by generation until they were no larger than heavy cattle. But for reptiles, the rules of island isolation are entirely different. Because they require less food to maintain their body temperature, and because they faced no competition from large mammalian carnivores, the cold-blooded reptiles grew to monstrous proportions. The tiny humans of Flores were forced to navigate a dark, tangled canopy, stalked by Komodo dragons stretching 4 meters long, equipped with serrated teeth and venomous bites. This was not a mythological fairy tale. It was a brutal, functioning and highly lethal food web, and the exact mechanics of it are permanently recorded in the limestone and dirt. In the year 2016, a team of researchers led by Gerrit van den Berg published definitive findings in the journal Nature, detailing extensive excavations at an ancient riverbed site called Mata Menga. Deep in the sediment, they uncovered the fossilized remains of a pygmy elephant species known to science as Stegodon florensis. Right alongside the bones of these miniature elephants, the researchers found the sharp stone tools and the fossilized traces of the tiny humans who hunted them. Homo floresiensis was not a passive, frightened victim, hiding in the shadows from giant lizards. They were organized, cooperative predators. They were actively tracking, ambushing, and butchering elephants that weighed no more than a modern dairy cow. What makes this bizarre ecosystem truly staggering is not just its inverted geometry. It is the sheer, unbreakable stability of the ancient island. The dating of the fossils at the Mata Menga site proves that this alternate reality of dwarf humans and pygmy elephants existed for over 700,000 years. Let the heavy weight of that timeline sink in. The tiny humans of Flores occupied a highly successful active predator niche on this nightmare island, for longer than Homo sapiens has even existed as a species. They endured local climate shifts, volcanic eruptions, changing sea levels, and the constant daily threat of giant reptilian predators. They outlasted the entire span of our own species' history, entirely by adapting to the strict mathematical limits of their environment. Their long, successful existence proves a fundamental truth about human survival. Endurance does not require dominance in physical size, and it does not require a massive, energy-hungry brain. It requires profound, unyielding adaptation to local reality. The island of Flores was not a freak evolutionary accident. It was a highly stable, alternative mechanism for human existence. For years, the mainstream scientific community desperately tried to write off the tiny, elephant-hunting humans of Flores as a bizarre, isolated exception. They were framed as a one-time glitch in the evolutionary timeline, a biological anomaly that could never happen twice. But the ocean of Southeast Asia is vast, and it holds more than one isolated laboratory. The comforting assumption that Flores was a singular, unrepeatable accident was about to be completely demolished. The proof was waiting in the dark recesses of a limestone cave in the Philippines. It is scientifically comforting to dismiss a shattered paradigm as an isolated anomaly. When the tiny humans of Flores were discovered, the easiest explanation was that they were a freak accident, a one-time glitch in the biological timeline. The idea that a human lineage could shrink to the size of a child was digestible, as long as it only happened once. But a single glitch is an anomaly. 2 glitches form a pattern. In the year 2019, a researcher named Florent Detroit published findings from Calao Cave on the island of Luzon in the Philippines. Deep in the limestone, excavators had uncovered a collection of teeth and foot bones dating back roughly 67,000 years. The remains were incredibly small, suggesting a creature barely taller than the hobbits of Flores. But they were not the same species. They belonged to a completely unknown human lineage, eventually named Homo luzonensis. It was the specific anatomy of those foot bones that broke the timeline. The pedal phalanges, the bones of the toes, were heavily curved. This is a distinct anatomical signature meant for grasping branches. It is a primitive feature that perfectly matches Australopithecus, an ancient ancestor that vanished from the African continent over 2 million years earlier. The islands of Southeast Asia were doing something impossible. They were reaching deep into the genetic past, pulling ancient traits forward and creating entirely new versions of humanity. And there is a haunting possibility that our own species witnessed this process. On the island of Flores, an anthropologist named Gregory Forth documented the deep oral traditions of the local Nage people. For generations, they have passed down stories of small, hairy, language-mimicking creatures that lived in the jungle. The villagers described them as walking upright, stealing food from the edges of modern camps, and murmuring back the words spoken by terrified humans. They call them the Ebu Gogo. Folklore is almost always dismissed as pure imagination. But when the physical Earth yields the hard bones of tiny primitive humans living in those exact same jungles, the line between myth and paleontology begins to dissolve. Island dwarfism did not just happen once, it happened at least twice. And human memory may have recorded the eerie reality of sharing a dense, closed ecosystem with them. The human family tree is not a single, towering trunk of inevitable progress. It is a tangled, repeating pattern of radical adaptation. Southeast Asia was a massive evolutionary laboratory that repeatedly took whatever human lineages washed ashore and violently reshaped them to fit the strict rules of the ocean. The fossils of Luzon and Flores prove that entire human species can be warped into unrecognizable forms. But even these bizarre, isolated experiments left behind hard physical evidence. They left teeth, skulls, and curved toes that we can carefully excavate and hold in our hands. The true mystery lies with the species that left nothing at all. To find them, we must pivot away from the heavy bones of the islands. We must look for the humans who vanished so completely that the Earth swallowed their skeletons whole. The islands of Southeast Asia prove that even the most bizarre evolutionary experiments leave behind a physical trace. We can find the fragile teeth and curved toes of miniature humans buried in the dirt of a tiny cave. We can map the anatomy of creatures that shrank to the size of children. But the survival of those small, delicate bones makes another absence deeply terrifying. It is one thing to lose track of a small, isolated island population. It is something entirely different when an entire continental lineage vanishes. What happens when a massive, thriving branch of the human family tree leaves absolutely nothing behind? To answer that, we have to pivot away from the physical dirt and look into the blood of the living. In developmental genetics, there is a concept known as a ghost lineage. It is the biological equivalent of seeing a dark shadow cast on a wall by an object that is no longer in the room. You cannot see the parent species. You cannot hold their skulls or measure their cranial capacity, but you can read their exact footprint, written perfectly into the genetic strands of their modern descendants. Introgression acts as a forensic fingerprint, proving a collision between two species even when one has completely disappeared. In the year 2020, researchers Arundhava Vasula and Sriram Sankararaman at UCLA published a groundbreaking genomic analysis. They examined the genetic code of modern Yoruba and Mende populations in West Africa. The researchers were looking for faint hidden signals of ancient ancestry inside the DNA. What they found was a massive biological shadow. Up to 19% of the genetic code in these living populations comes directly from an entirely unknown, archaic human species. It was a staggering volume of inherited material, far larger than the Neanderthal traces found in Europeans. This was not a minor genetic drift or a brief evolutionary accident. The data describes a vast, distinct branch of humanity that diverged from our own ancestral line roughly 625,000 years ago. They lived, adapted, and evolved in parallel to our ancestors for hundreds of millennia. And then, roughly 150,000 years ago, they crossed paths with the early members of Homo sapiens. They shared fires, they merged their populations, and they passed their genetic inheritance forward into the future. But here is the stark, unsettling reality of that inheritance. A species that contributed nearly a fifth of a modern human genome has been completely erased from the physical Earth. Paleontologists have searched the continent for decades, turning over the soil in search of our origins, yet not a single skull has ever been found. Not a jawbone, not a scattered tooth, not a splinter of a femur. 0 fossils exist for this massive branch of humanity. They are known exclusively by the code they left behind. The biological evidence proves beyond any doubt that they were here. It proves they lived, they breathed, they hunted, and they bred with our ancestors. But their physical bodies were swallowed whole by the planet. We are forced to confront a strange and humbling truth about the fragility of human history. The microscopic architecture of the human genome is a far more permanent archive than solid stone or heavy bone. The Earth forgets, but the blood remembers. But this realization raises a chilling logistical question. If this ghost species was real, and if their population was large enough to leave such a massive genetic footprint, where are all of their dead? Millions of these ancient humans lived and died across the African continent over hundreds of thousands of years. What kind of terrestrial force is powerful enough to consume millions of skeletons, completely erasing an entire civilization of archaic humans without leaving a single trace in the dirt. The science of human origins is anchored by a fundamental, almost comforting bias. If a species truly existed, we expect to find its bones. We demand a physical skull to measure, a jawbone to date, or at least a fragment of a femur to place carefully in a museum display. The official story of our past relies on a very simple assumption. It assumes that if there is no physical skeleton in the dirt, then the species simply was not there. But that assumption ignores the harsh, active chemistry of the Earth itself. To understand how an entire branch of humanity could vanish without leaving a single trace, we have to look at a mechanism called taphonomy. This is the precise geological science of how organic material breaks down after death. Human bone is incredible architecture, but it is primarily composed of calcium phosphate. It is highly durable when it's frozen in the deep permafrost of Siberia, or when it is sealed inside the dry limestone caves of Europe. But bone is inherently vulnerable to acid, and in certain environments the ground itself acts as a slow, relentless solvent. The ghost species identified in the genetic code did not live in a frozen wasteland. They lived in equatorial West and Central Africa. This is a massive, intensely humid, tropical environment where the soils are deeply acidic. When an ancient human died in this kind of jungle biome, the heavy moisture and rapid fungal decay stripped away the soft tissue almost immediately. Then the acidic soil went to work on the calcium. In these specific geological conditions, a thick human femur does not slowly turn to stone. It dissolves. Within a few centuries, the heavy bone is completely broken down. It is reabsorbed into the earth, and it is permanently erased. This means that the total absence of fossils in this region is not proof that the landscape was empty. The absence of evidence is actually a predictable geological feature. We are trained by textbooks to think of fossilization as a natural rite of history, but it is actually a remarkably rare, localized accident. The vast majority of living things are designed to be consumed and recycled by the planet. The terrestrial force that erased this ghost species was not a sudden catastrophe. It was just the chemistry of the dirt. The fossil record is not simply an incomplete book with a few missing pages. It is an archive that the Earth actively and systematically empties. Millions of these archaic humans lived, hunted and died across the African continent over a span of hundreds of thousands of years. They diverged from our lineage roughly 625,000 years ago, and they held their ground for millennia. Yet the soil swallowed every single one of them. This is why the official map of human evolution looks so neat and uncluttered. It is clean only because the physical terrain has been wiped clean. Entire civilizations of archaic humans could have flourished in these tropical zones. They could have dominated the landscape for thousands of generations, and we would have absolutely no idea they were ever there. Our physical archives would be entirely blind to them. The only reason we know this massive branch of the human family existed at all is because they left a shadow in the blood of the living, up to 19% of a genome, surviving long after the bones turn to dust. But if the acidic soil of the tropics can completely erase a species that contributed a fifth of a human genome, it forces a much larger question. Africa was not the only continent with dense jungles and corrosive soils. If this ghost lineage successfully hid inside modern DNA, how many other ghosts are hiding in the rest of the global genome? The answer to that question is written across the entire world. The phantom species we carry in our blood is not an isolated regional exception. It is just one piece of a massive global pattern of erased humanities. To understand the true scale of what is missing, we must completely discard the way we were taught to think about our own origins. For generations, science instructed us to visualize human evolution as a single sturdy tree. We pictured a solid central trunk growing straight upward out of the deep past, shedding primitive traits and culminating cleanly in Homo sapiens. It was a comforting image of inevitable progress. But the genetic data refuses to support that elegant, simple picture. The real human family tree is not a single trunk. It is a dense, tangled thicket. It is a chaotic web of unnamed branches wrapping around each other, merging in the dark and breaking off without warning. When geneticists look closely at the DNA of living people, the sheer volume of missing species becomes staggering. In the year 2019, a team led by Guy Jacobs analysed the genomes of modern Papuan populations. They were looking for the standard Denisovan genetic signature, but they found something far more complex. They identified at least 3 deeply divergent Denisovan ancestries. These were not just scattered individuals, they were entirely distinct populations that separated from each other hundreds of thousands of years earlier. They thrived and evolved independently across Southeast Asia for millennia, before fading into genetic shadows. But the timeline goes even deeper. In 2020, Alan Rogers and his research team published a study detailing the signature of a super-archaic ghost population. This was an entirely unknown, deeply ancient branch of humanity. The data showed that this super-archaic ghost interbred with the common ancestor of Neanderthals and Denisovans roughly 700,000 years ago. It was a massive established lineage that walked the Earth long before our own species had even taken shape. And just like the African ghost species, they left zero physical trace. They exist only as a distant whisper embedded in the code of their descendants, and the genome is not the only place where the lonely timeline shatters. The physical dirt still holds impossible overlaps. Deep in the narrow passages of the Rising Star Cave system in South Africa, researchers found the bone assemblages of Homo naledi. They were small-brained, physically primitive humans who looked as though they belonged millions of years in the past. But the dating proved they did not live millions of years ago. They were navigating deep cave systems, and likely disposing of their dead right at the exact same time that early Homo sapiens were walking the African landscape. The textbook version of a lonely human rise is entirely false. We were never the inevitable pinnacle of evolution, marching alone upon an empty stage. The Earth was absolutely teeming with different human species. They were occupying separate ecological niches, adapting to extreme altitudes, crossing oceans and sharing the same valleys. We were just one option in a crowded, intensely diverse world of parallel humanities. For hundreds of thousands of years, we were surrounded by intelligent, capable cousins. The planet belonged to all of us. But that crowded, thriving world is gone. Today, we're the only ones left. To understand how a planet filled with multiple human species was systematically emptied out, we have to stop looking at the dirt and start looking at the sky. Because 74,000 years ago, the ground began to shake beneath Sumatra. The first great planetary cataclysm was preparing to detonate, and it was about to test the survival of every single human species on Earth at exactly the same time. The sky did not just darken, it shattered. For hundreds of thousands of years, the diverse, crowded world of parallel humanities had thrived across the continents. They had adapted to deep ice and isolated oceanic islands. They had painted caves, hunted massive megafauna, and slowly woven their genetic branches together. And then, in a single geological instant, the Earth turned violently against all of them. Beneath the island of Sumatra, the immense pressure that had been building for millennia finally broke the crust. To grasp what happened next, we have to completely abandon our normal understanding of the volcanic eruption. This was not a mountain venting ash into the clouds, it was an apocalypse rising from the ground. When the Toba supervolcano detonated, it violently ejected approximately 2,800 cubic kilometers of solid rock, ash, and magma into the stratosphere. Visualize the sheer physical weight of that number. Imagine a solid block of stone, 1 kilometer wide, 1 kilometer tall, and stretching 2,800 kilometers across the curvature of the Earth. Now imagine that entire mass pulverized into microscopic glass and blasted into the upper atmosphere in a matter of days. The precise scale of this cataclysm was meticulously calculated by Craig Chesner and his colleagues in a landmark 1991 study. Their analysis firmly established the Toba eruption, striking exactly 74,000 years ago, as a magnitude 8 volcanic explosivity index event. It was the single largest volcanic detonation of the last 2 million years. The force of the blast was so absolute that it did not simply blow the top off a mountain, it entirely hollowed out the crust of the Earth. The collapsed rock left behind a massive open scar in Sumatra, a caldera so large it now holds a lake 100 kilometers long and 30 kilometers wide. But the immediate blast was only the beginning. The sky was rapidly consumed by a suffocating cloud of pulverized rock and toxic sulfur. This material was caught by high-altitude winds, spreading an immense canopy across the hemisphere. We know exactly how far it reached because the debris did not vanish. Geologists track a distinct, suffocating blanket of fallout known as the youngest Toba Tuff. This uninterrupted layer of pale ash settled heavily across the entire Indian subcontinent. It choked the deep floor of the Indian Ocean. It drifted thousands of kilometers eastward, falling like toxic snow across the South China Sea. This layer of ancient ash represents something far darker than a simple geological anomaly. This was not just a localized natural disaster. It was an indiscriminate, extinction-level test for every single human species alive. The Neanderthals in Europe, the Denisovans on the high plateaus of Asia, the miniature humans on the remote islands, and our own early ancestors in Africa. All of them looked up to see the exact same creeping darkness swallowing the sun. The crowded, thriving world of diverse humanities was suddenly plunged into years of toxic twilight. The global temperature plummeted. Plant life withered under the darkened sky. The massive herds of the mammoth steppe starved. The environment that had nurtured at least 7 different human lineages instantly transformed into a hostile, freezing wasteland. The Earth was actively trying to erase them. Millions of individuals across multiple species found themselves trapped under a sky that refused to clear. They were forced to endure a volcanic winter that would drag on for years, pushing their biology to the absolute breaking point. But for one specific branch of the human family tree, the darkness brought something worse than starvation. It brought our direct ancestors so close to total, permanent annihilation that the terrifying scar of that near extinction is still written into the genetic code of every human being alive today. The terrifying scar left by the Toba eruption is not found in the geological sediment. It is a mathematical absence, written directly into the mitochondrial DNA of every person alive today. Mitochondrial DNA is inherited almost exclusively through the maternal line. It acts as a relentless biological clock. It tracks the expansions and the contractions of a species over hundreds of thousands of years. It remembers exactly when we thrived, and it remembers exactly when we almost vanished completely. When a population is healthy and growing, its genetic code branches out. The diversity expands outward, creating a wide, complex canopy of minor biological variations. But when a population faces a sudden extinction-level event, those branches are violently pruned. The tree is stripped bare. If you look at the genetic diversity of the billions of Homo sapiens on Earth right now, you do not see a wide canopy. You see a severe, unnatural narrowing in the deep past. The code traces backward in time, and then it suddenly chokes. It forms a massive, undeniable bottleneck. In 1998, a researcher named Stanley Ambrose proposed a hypothesis that matched this terrifying genetic reality. He linked the devastating volcanic winter of the Toba eruption directly to this sudden collapse in human genetic diversity. The data describes a population crash so extreme that it defies modern comprehension. The entire global breeding population of Homo sapiens plummeted. Our ancestors were reduced to perhaps 10,000 breeding pairs, and some genetic models suggest the number fell even further, to as few as 3,000. 3,000 pairs. Take a moment to let the sheer fragility of that number sink in. The entire future of humanity was hanging by a singular fraying thread. The ancestors of every civilization, every empire, and every living family were reduced to a total population smaller than a single modern small town. And these survivors were not gathered together in one safe refuge. They were scattered across continents, completely isolated, and trapped under a sky that had turned into a toxic twilight. We can actually see the faint traces of these isolated holdouts in the dirt. In 2007, researcher Michael Petralia and his team uncovered stone tools in the Indian subcontinent. Crucially, these tools were found directly below the heavy layer of Toba ash, and directly above it. Some observers have tried to use this continuity to argue that the volcanic winter was not a true apocalypse. But the stone tools do not disprove the terrifying genetic bottleneck. They describe something much more desperate. They represent isolated, starving survival pockets. They are the physical remnants of tiny bands of humans clinging to life, surrounded by a terrestrial ecosystem that was rapidly shutting down. The grazing animals had nothing to eat. The mammoth steppe was freezing over. The cold was absolute and unforgiving. Every single person alive today exists only because a microscopic fraction of our ancestors simply refused to surrender to the dark. The immense weight of our entire modern world, every city ever built, every spoken language, every war, and every scientific discovery was carried through those frozen years by a few thousand exhausted, terrified survivors. But sheer willpower cannot feed a starving population. The terrestrial food web was fundamentally broken under a sky choked with volcanic ash. To survive years of unbroken winter, a handful of these desperate bands had to make a critical shift. They had to abandon the dying interior of the continents. They had to find an environment and a food source that did not rely entirely on the sun to sustain life. They had to walk out of the frozen grasslands and move toward the crashing waves of the southern coast. The darkness of the volcanic winter choked the life out of the continental interiors. Across the massive expanses of the Mammoth Steppe and the deep tropical forests of the equator, the terrestrial food web rapidly collapsed. As the airborne ash blocked the sun for years on end, the plants withered, starving the massive grazing animals, which in turn starved the predators that hunted them. The inland world became a frozen, silent graveyard where survival was nearly impossible. But the ocean operates on an entirely different biological clock. While the terrestrial plants were dying under a sky choked with volcanic ash, the coastal marine ecosystems remained largely indifferent to the missing sun. The tidal zones were fueled by deep ocean upwelling and relentless currents, providing a dense, continually regenerating supply of protein that did not require sunlight to thrive. The crashing waves offered a sanctuary, a narrow, wet margin of survival where the freezing rules of the volcanic winter did not apply. We know exactly where humanity found this sanctuary. In the year 2007, a researcher named Curtis Marion excavated a site known as Pinnacle Point 13B, located near Mossel Bay on the southern coast of South Africa. Deep inside this coastal cave system, the archaeological layers revealed a continuous, unbroken record of human occupation, spanning the exact timeline of the Toba supervolcano. The geological ashes from the eruption were found in the surrounding region, but the human presence inside the cave never stopped. The dirt was densely packed with the cracked shells of marine mollusks, dating back 164,000 years and continuing right through the darkest, coldest years of the cataclysm. These people did not suddenly invent shellfish harvesting out of blind, starving desperation when the sky went dark. The deep archaeological layers at Pinnacle Point proved that this coastal diet was a pre-existing, highly refined adaptation. For tens of thousands of years before the volcano ever erupted, these people had already mastered the tides. They understood how to track the lunar cycles to safely navigate the treacherous rocky shores. They possessed a highly specialized set of survival skills that just happened to be entirely catastrophe-proof. When the terrestrial world ended, they were already perfectly positioned to endure the fallout. It is a staggering realization. The entire future of the human species, every empire yet to be built, every scientific revolution, every single living person on Earth today, funneled down to a few thousand exhausted people cracking open shells on a narrow, wind-swept strip of the South African coast. While the rest of the planet froze in a long unbroken twilight, this tiny, isolated pocket of humanity sat by their fires in the caves of Mossel Bay. They ate the harvest of the sea, they maintained their tools, and they waited for the sky to clear. The coast literally saved the species. The mathematical reality of the genetic bottleneck proves just how incredibly close Homo sapiens came to total, permanent erasure. But Pinnacle Point proves exactly how we avoided it. We exist today only because this small, intelligent band of survivors simply refused to die. They held on to the absolute edge of the continent, using their accumulated knowledge of the ocean to outlast an apocalypse that was actively wiping out other human lineages across the globe. But sheer survival is only the beginning of the story. Once the skies finally cleared and the sun slowly returned to the Mammoth Steppe, these survivors did not just repopulate a broken, empty world. They carried something else out of that darkness. The trauma of near extinction could have easily reduced them to brutal, unfeeling scavengers, forcing them to abandon their weak just to save the strong. Instead, the fragile traces they left behind reveal a species that survived by doing the exact opposite. To understand what these people deeply valued, we have to look past their desperate coastal fires. We have to look at how they treated the most vulnerable creatures in the cold, harsh world they inherited. The answer to what these survivors truly valued was buried near Bonn, Germany, roughly 14,200 years ago. Beneath the heavy basalt rocks of a site called Oberkassel, archaeologists uncovered a grave dating back to the late Pleistocene. Inside the earth, They found the remains of an adult man, an older woman, and the small, fragile skeleton of a puppy. At first glance, it is simply an early record of an animal living near humans. But to understand the true weight of this grave, you have to understand the brutal, unforgiving reality of the canine distemper virus. Distemper is a highly contagious, aggressive pathogen. Even today, without modern veterinary medicine, it kills the vast majority of infected dogs within a matter of weeks. The physical toll is devastating. A puppy fighting this virus cannot swallow food or keep itself clean. It suffers from severe dehydrating fever, respiratory failure, and violent neurological seizures. To keep an infected animal alive in the wild requires relentless, intensive human intervention. It requires someone to hand-feed water drop by drop. It requires someone to continually clean away the sickness, to keep the shivering animal warm, and to physically hold it through endless hours of seizing muscle. In the year 2018, a team of researchers led by Luc Janssens conducted a pathological re-examination of the Oberkassel dog. They looked closely at the microscopic structure of the puppy's teeth. Hidden inside the bone, they found severe enamel hyperplasia. This is a permanent physical scarring in the dental record. It occurs when a developing body completely halts its own physical growth just to fight off a lethal infection. But the teeth did not just show one scar. They showed two distinct lines of trauma. The pathology proved that this puppy contracted the fatal virus, survived a grueling recovery, and then contracted it a second time. The microscopic evidence translates into an incredibly intimate lived reality. 14,000 years ago, an ancient human sat in the freezing cold with a dying animal. They gave up their own scarce, desperately needed calories. They sacrificed their sleep. They nursed a sick puppy through weeks of fever and pain, refusing to let it suffer alone. And when the animal finally succumbed to the harshness of the Pleistocene world, they did not discard the body into the snow. They dug a grave, laying the small dog to rest right beside their own dead. We are often taught that the domestication of dogs was a cold, practical transaction. The standard narrative claims that wolves scavenged around human camps. People tolerated them for protection, and a mutual utility slowly evolved. The Oberkassel burial shatters that mechanical assumption. The bond between human and animal was not driven entirely by hunting utility. It was driven by deep, profound empathy. This realization changes how we must view the humans who weathered the ice ages. Their greatest evolutionary weapon was not just the stone spear or the mastery of fire. It was their astonishing capacity for emotional attachment. This cross-species love, this absolute refusal to abandon a vulnerable creature, existed tens of thousands of years before civilization. Empathy was their true survival advantage. If these ancient people were willing to endure such extreme hardship just to comfort a dying animal, we have to ask what they did for their own flesh and blood. How did they protect the most fragile members of their own families when the glaciers closed in? The answer was not found in a grave. It was found pressed firmly into the mud of a vanished lakeshore. It is an intimate trace, frozen in time, capturing the exact moment a parent carried a child into a forbidden world. The dry, blinding expanse of White Sands National Park in New Mexico hides a ghost story written in the earth. Beneath the shifting dunes lies the bed of a vanished Pleistocene lake, and pressed into the mud of that ancient shore is a trackway that defies the established laws of history. It is not a scatter of stone tools or a pile of butchered bones. It is a continuous sequence of human footprints. If you follow the tracks, they do not read like abstract data. They read like a cinematic memory, capturing a lived, intimate moment playing out across a frozen landscape. The trackway shows an adult, likely a young woman, walking rapidly across the slippery mud. Her footprints shift and slide under a heavy, uneven weight. She's carrying a toddler on one hip. As the sequence continues, the parent stops. She sets the child down. For a brief distance, a set of tiny, bare footprints appears right beside the adult tracks. The child takes a few unsteady steps in the wet earth, and then the small footprints vanish. The parent picks the child up again, shifts her weight, and continues walking into the distance. It is an image of profound, ordinary humanity. But the mud that captured this ordinary moment also captured a biological clock. Embedded directly inside the footprints were the microscopic seeds of an aquatic plant called Ruppia serosa. In the year 2021, a research team led by Matthew Bennett published the radiocarbon dates of those seeds in the journal Science. The numbers were impossible under the old academic framework. The seeds, and the footprints that crushed them, dated to between 23,000 and 21,000 years ago. That specific stretch of time is exactly what fractures the official story. 23,000 years ago was the absolute peak of the last glacial maximum. The northern half of the continent was buried under massive, impenetrable walls of ice. The famous ice-free corridor, which was supposed to be the only route into the Americas, was completely sealed shut. According to every established textbook, the Western Hemisphere was entirely devoid of human life. It was supposed to be a vast, untouched wilderness, waiting for the ice to melt. For decades, the Clovis First narrative functioned as an unquestionable academic law. It dictated that the first humans crossed into the Americas roughly 13,000 years ago, long after the great continental ice sheets had begun to retreat. Any claim of an earlier arrival was aggressively dismissed as a geological error, a misidentified rock, or a contaminated sample. The academic gates were firmly locked, but you cannot dismiss a continuous sequence of human footsteps. These tracks do not merely push the timeline back by a few centuries. They prove that the foundational history of the Americas was fundamentally wrong. The clean linear map of human migration is a fiction. The real story is far older and far more complex. Over 10,000 years before the official timeline allowed them to exist, real people were walking across a freezing alien world. They were navigating a landscape ruled by giant ground sloths and saber-toothed cats, surviving in the shadow of a sealed ice sheet and carrying their young through the mud. This trackway at White Sands captures the everyday devotion of a parent carrying a healthy child to keep them safe. It is an act of protection that spans a few brief moments in the dirt. But if these ancient people were willing to carry a toddler across a frozen lakeshore, we must ask what they did when the burden was permanent. What happens when the child they are carrying is sick and will never be able to walk on their own? The answer to that question was not found in the Americas. It was uncovered deep in the freezing earth near the modern city of Vladimir, Russia, at an archaeological site known as Sunghir. Beneath the permafrost, researchers found a grave dating back 34,000 years. Inside it were the remains of two adolescents, buried head-to-head in a single carefully constructed trench. When physical anthropologist Eric Trinkhaus and his colleagues published a detailed examination of the remains in 2014, they documented a reality that completely defied our expectations of the ancient world. One of the adolescents possessed severe skeletal pathology. The bones showed clear, undeniable evidence of a profound, lifelong physical disability. This was a child who could not have walked normally across the uneven ground. They could not have hunted the megafauna. They could not have survived a single week on the freezing mammoth steppe without constant, dedicated community care. Yet they survived to adolescence. This means their tribe fed them, protected them, and physically carried them across a hostile, frozen landscape for years. And when this child finally died, their community did not just dig a shallow hole in the snow and move on. They buried the two adolescents with carved ivory spears, fox-tooth pendants, ivory animal figurines, and an estimated 10,000 mammoth ivory beads. To truly understand the weight of that burial, you have to measure those beads not as physical objects, but as a staggering expenditure of time. Experimental archaeology demonstrates that carving just one of these tiny ivory beads, carefully piercing it, and polishing it with stone tools takes approximately 45 minutes. 10,000 beads represent roughly 7,500 hours of intense, focused manual labour. We are often taught to imagine the Pleistocene epoch as a brutal, unforgiving era governed strictly by the survival of the fittest. The popular myth of the Ice Age depicts a harsh, mechanical world where a struggling tribe would be forced to abandon their weak just to survive the winter. But the evidence in the dirt tells the exact opposite story. A nomadic community, living on the absolute edge of a frozen continent, stopped everything they were doing. They invested thousands of hours of their collective survival time into carving exquisite ivory ornaments for a child who could never physically contribute to the defense or the feeding of the group. Compassion is not a modern luxury. It was not invented within the safe, warm walls of the first agricultural cities. Empathy is a foundational human trait, stretching back tens of thousands of years before the concept of civilization even existed. It was the very mechanism that allowed our species to endure the volcanic winters, the catastrophic genetic bottlenecks, and the encroaching glaciers. We survived the erased world because we refused to abandon each other. The grave at Sungir describes our species at its absolute best. It shows us a resilient, deeply empathetic humanity that had survived the worst the Earth could throw at them. They had conquered the frozen landscapes, they had learned to care for their most vulnerable members, and they had built a world rich with art, memory, and profound love. They were a species fully prepared to inherit the Earth. But this beautiful, crowded, deeply human world was living on borrowed time. Just as they reached this peak of cultural and emotional complexity, the timeline was violently interrupted. Because 12,800 years ago, the quiet empathy of the Pleistocene was suddenly and permanently erased by a catastrophic blinding strike from the sky. The timeline of the Pleistocene did not slowly degrade. It broke. Deep inside the GISP2 ice core, drilled from the center of the Greenland ice sheet, the exact moment of that total collapse is perfectly preserved in the compressed layers of ancient snow. At exactly 12,800 years ago, the chemical composition of the ice severely and violently changes. The background levels of platinum suddenly spike by a factor of 100. To a paleoclimatologist, a platinum anomaly of this extreme magnitude is not just a strange atmospheric fluctuation. It is not an unusual terrestrial volcanic event. It is a cosmic barcode. Elements like platinum and iridium are incredibly rare on the surface of the Earth, locked deep in the planetary core, but they are highly abundant in asteroids and comets. When you find a sudden concentrated spike of these heavy metals trapped in a single, razor-thin layer of global ice, it acts as an undeniable chemical fingerprint. It means something massive and incredibly fast arrived from the dark of space. In 2013, a research team led by Mikhail Petayev published findings that definitively tied this extraterrestrial platinum spike to the exact onset of the Younger Dryas. This is the boundary layer. It marks the specific geological moment when the warming trend of the late Pleistocene was violently reversed. Within a matter of decades, the northern hemisphere was plunged back into deep, punishing glacial conditions. The ice core does not show a slow climate transition. It shows an immediate catastrophic shock to the entire planetary system. Up until this exact layer in the ice, the human family tree had proven itself to be virtually indestructible. The Denisovans had expanded across the high, freezing Tibetan Plateau. Homo floresiensis had survived for hundreds of thousands of years on their isolated, predator-filled islands. The coastal survivors of the Toba supervolcano had weathered years of ash-choked skies. The incredibly compassionate bands of Homo sapiens had learned to protect their most vulnerable children in the Russian permafrost. All of these parallel humanities had successfully adapted to the brutal, grinding realities of the Earth. They had survived shifting climates, collapsing food webs, and terrestrial disasters that would easily break modern civilization. But they were completely defenseless against this. The platinum spike proves that this was not a terrestrial cataclysm. It was an event from outside the planet. You can build fires to survive the freezing cold. You can harvest shellfish to survive a volcanic winter, but you cannot evolve an immune response to a cosmic impact. You cannot migrate away from a kinetic shockwave that wraps around an entire hemisphere in a matter of hours. The geological record describes a single, terrifying moment when the sky itself became a weapon. It was an instant where the slow, steady rules of biological evolution were completely suspended, and the multi-species world was broken instantly. The human lineages that had patiently endured 300,000 years of ice ages suddenly faced an apocalyptic force that no amount of empathy, intelligence, or adaptation could prepare them for. But the platinum anomaly trapped in the Greenland ice is only an invisible chemical signature. It tells us that something struck the planet, but it does not show us the raw violence of the impact itself. To see what actually happened on the ground when that cosmic material arrived, we have to look away from the clean, frozen ice. We have to look down deep into the dark dirt, where the physical, scorched debris of a shattered sky is still scattered across the continents. When geologists look down at the exact sedimentary boundary layer corresponding to 12,800 years ago, they do not just find a chemical anomaly. The invisible platinum spike in the ice is matched by something much darker in the Earth. They find the scorched, shattered physical wreckage of a cataclysm. Embedded in the dirt across multiple continents is a dense black layer. Inside that boundary, researchers sifted through the soil and found a massive concentration of magnetic microspherules and nanodiamonds. These microscopic diamonds are not a natural byproduct of a changing planet. They cannot be formed by an ordinary forest fire, and they cannot be created by a slow shift in the climate. Nanodiamonds require an environment of extreme, unimaginable violence. They only materialize under pressures exceeding 70 gigapascals. To find that specific pressure on the surface of the Earth, you have to look inside the detonation zone of a nuclear weapon, or at the exact epicenter of a cosmic impact. The scientific record is extremely clear about what lies in the dirt. In 2007, a massive study led by Richard Firestone documented exactly this kind of microscopic debris scattered across the North American continent. The boundary layer was choked with impact markers. The Earth was covered in the metallic dust of a shattered object. But the destruction was not contained to just one continent. Thousands of miles away, the heat of that exact same moment was permanently recorded in stone. In 2020, researchers led by Andrew Moore published their examination of an ancient settlement in Syria known as Abu Huraira. Beneath the ruins, perfectly aligned with the 12,800-year boundary, they found melted building material and shattered bone encased in glass. This melt glass contained minerals that require temperatures above 2,200 degrees Celsius to form. An ordinary Paleolithic fire cannot melt dirt into glass. A terrestrial phenomenon cannot generate that kind of localized heat. The physical evidence does not point to a single neat terrestrial crater. It describes an event that was far more volatile. The geological record points to a massive fragmented comet entering the atmosphere. Instead of striking the ground as a single solid mass, the fragments detonated in the air. It was a multi-site airburst scenario, a barrage of cosmic detonations raining fire, molten metal, and shock waves across the entire northern hemisphere. The true horror of a fragmented airburst is its absolute inescapable suddenness. There is no warning, there is no time to migrate and no time to hide. The heat and the overpressure simply arrive from the sky. In the exact moment those comet fragments detonated, entire ecosystems were incinerated before the animals inside them could even register a threat. Ancient forests were flattened in a fraction of a second. The ground itself was flash-baked into liquid glass. For decades, the accepted historical narrative was that the ancient world faded away slowly. We were taught that the Pleistocene epoch ended gradually, through thousands of years of shifting climate, but the nanodiamonds and the melt glass completely destroy the theory of a gradual decline. The physical evidence leaves absolutely no room for a slow, peaceful transition. It was a cosmic strike that instantly reset the northern hemisphere, turning a thriving planet into a burning wasteland. The geological debris in the dirt proves that the sky became a weapon, but the rocks and the glass only tell us how the event happened. To truly understand the terrifying scale of the cataclysm, we have to look at what it actually destroyed. We have to turn away from the microscopic diamonds and look at the massive biological death toll of the giants that never woke up. The biological cost of the impact was absolute. When the sky finally cleared, the world had fundamentally changed. In a narrow, violent window of time at the onset of the Younger Dryas, roughly 75% of all large mammal genera in North America simply disappeared from the fossil record. These were not fragile, marginal creatures. They were the titans that had defined the landscape for millions of years. The woolly mammoths, the mastodons, the saber-toothed cats, the giant ground sloths, the Native American horses, and the American camels. In what amounts to a geological instant, the giants were gone. In 2009, researchers Tyler Faith and Todd Suravel mapped this massive wave of extinction, demonstrating that the peak of the collapse perfectly aligned with the exact boundary layer of the cosmic strike. But the physical impact did not just incinerate the megafauna, it triggered a cascade that broke the planetary climate system itself. In 2006, paleoclimatologist Wallace Brooker described the mechanism that followed the fire. The impact and the sudden melting of the ice sheets caused a catastrophic pulse of fresh water to flood into the northern oceans. This sudden influx of cold, fresh water disrupted the Atlantic meridional overturning circulation, the deep ocean conveyor belt that brings warmth to the north. The Gulf Stream effectively shut down. The northern hemisphere was immediately plunged back into a deep freezing glacial state. The animals that survived the initial fire starved in the sudden relentless ice that followed. Across the continents, the death of these massive ecosystem engineers was rapid and total. But the extinction was not perfectly clean. Far to the north, cut off by rising sea levels, a tiny remnant of the old world managed to survive the initial cataclysm. On the remote, freezing outpost of Wrangel Island in the Arctic Ocean, a small herd of woolly mammoths was left behind, completely isolated from the mainland. They held on for thousands of years, surviving until roughly 4,000 years ago, long after the first human cities had been built and the pyramids of Egypt were rising. But they were trapped on a shrinking sanctuary. In 2017, geneticists Rebecca Rogers and Montgomery Slatkin analysed the DNA of these very last mammoths, and they found a tragedy written directly into the code. The population had collapsed to roughly 300 individuals. Cut off from the rest of their kind with no new genetic diversity, they suffered a complete genomic meltdown. Harmful mutations accumulated rapidly in their DNA. They lost their sense of smell, their heavy coats degraded, and their basic biology unravelled. They did not die in a sudden flash of heat or a human trap. They died of genetic loneliness, quietly fading away in a world that had moved on without them. When the last mammoth fell on Wrangel Island, the Pleistocene was officially over. The Mammoth Steppe, the massive actively engineered grassland that had sustained our ancestors, fed the Denisovans and sheltered the Neanderthals, was permanently erased from the Earth. The ecosystem that had forged every known human species was gone forever. The apocalyptic violence of the Younger Dryas eventually burned itself out. The ice sheets began their final retreat. The global temperatures slowly stabilized, and the Earth crossed the threshold into a new geological era. For the human survivors, the world that followed would feel like a permanent quiet sanctuary. But this new era of warmth and safety was a brilliant deception. The brilliant deception of the new era began roughly 11,700 years ago. The apocalyptic violence of the Younger Dryas finally burned itself out. The massive continental ice sheets, which had crushed North America and Europe for tens of thousands of years, began their slow, silent retreat. Global temperatures stabilized. The world settled into a quiet, warm, and remarkably predictable climate phase that geologists call the Holocene. For the human survivors standing in the thawing mud, the freezing nightmare of the Pleistocene was officially over. The planet had finally become a safe, permanent sanctuary. But to understand the true nature of this warmth, you have to step away from the surface of the Earth. You must look at the invisible orbital mechanics that drag the planet through the dark vacuum of space. The climate is not entirely driven by what happens on the ground. It is dictated by a massive, silent cosmic clock known as the Milankovitch cycles. The shape of the Earth's orbit, its eccentricity, slowly stretches from a circle into an oval and back again. The tilt of the planet's axis, its obliquity, gently nods back and forth. And the direction the axis points, its precession, wobbles like a heavy, dying, spinning top. Together, these celestial gears dictate exactly how much sunlight reaches the northern latitudes. They are the detached architects of the climate, deciding when the ice sheets advance and when they retreat. In the year 2002, researchers André Berger and Marie-France Loutre published a deep mathematical modelling of these exact orbital parameters. Their celestial math mapped the rhythmic, unstoppable pulse of the ice ages. Because the Earth's orbit is currently experiencing a period of very low eccentricity, meaning its path around the Sun is almost perfectly circular, they calculated that this current warm period is exceptionally stable. Their models showed that this interglacial phase could stretch on for another 50,000 years before the glaciers inevitably push south again. 50,000 years gives the illusion of absolute safety. But when you look at that number against the deep timeline of the human family tree, the perspective violently shifts. Every single thing that we call human civilization was built exclusively inside this specific, narrow window of warmth. Every stone temple, every empire that rose and fell, every paved road, and every single page of recorded history exists entirely within the last 11,700 years. The Holocene is not a permanent era of planetary safety. The Ice Ages did not end just because human beings learned how to plant wheat and build cities. The geological reality is much colder. This warm period is merely a pause. The Holocene is an interglacial interlude, a temporary quiet breath in an ongoing, unrelenting cycle of advancing and retreating ice. The Milankovitch cycles have never stopped turning. The orbital clock is still ticking, completely indifferent to the civilizations we build on the surface. We look at our modern world and believe that we are the absolute masters of the Earth. But we are simply the species that managed to survive the latest planetary reset. We are building our entire reality, our entire towering civilization, during a brief geological intermission. The warmth we rely on is temporary. The ice has always returned, and the mechanics of the solar system guarantee that it will return again. If the orbital mechanics dictate that the cycle is unbroken, the ultimate question is not whether the freezing darkness will come back. The question is what we actually possess to survive it. When the climate inevitably turns, and the long winter begins again, what biological tools do we have left? To find the answer, we must look at the genetic ghosts we carry, and realize exactly what the extinct giants of the Pleistocene left behind inside our own cells. To find those biological tools, we have to pull our focus away from the massive planetary scale of orbital mechanics and look deep into the microscopic architecture of our own bodies. The genetic ghosts we carry are not silent museum exhibits locked away in the dark. The DNA of the Neanderthals and the Denisovans is awake. It is actively functioning, reading and executing commands inside the biology of billions of living human beings at this very exact moment. When evolutionary biologists speak of archaic genetic introgression, it is easy to mistake it for abstract data, a few statistical anomalies buried on a laboratory spreadsheet. But this DNA is not abstract. It is the physical, visceral machinery of human survival. It is the keratin protein forming the structure of your skin, your hair and your nails, built to withstand the biting cold of a harsh climate. It is the rapid, aggressive immune response that fights off local pathogens and ancient viruses your ancestors had never encountered before. It is the EPAS1 gene, the specific Denisovan sequence that regulates hemoglobin production, allowing millions of people on the Tibetan Plateau to breathe the thin, freezing air at 4,000 meters above sea level, without their blood thickening to a fatal crawl. In the year 2014, geneticist Sriram Sankararaman and his colleagues mapped the specific landscape of Neanderthal ancestry across present-day human populations. When they analysed the genome, they did not just find random decaying fragments of broken code. They found highly functional, positively selected biological architecture. The extinct species had handed down genes governing the human immune system and our susceptibility to disease. They left behind the exact biological tools required to survive the harsh, pathogen-rich environments that they had already spent hundreds of thousands of years mastering. This realization forces us to completely reframe the concept of extinction. The Neanderthals, the Denisovans, and the unnamed ghost species of the deep past did not completely vanish from the Earth. They were not simply wiped off the map by the Younger Dryas impact or the volcanic winter of Toba, leaving Homo sapiens to walk alone through the wreckage. They merged with us. They became the literal biological architecture of the survivors. The giants of the Pleistocene did not just die out in the cold, they dissolved into the living population. For over a century, the official historical narrative taught us to view these archaic humans as primitive dead ends. They were cast as failed, brutish experiments in human evolution who simply could not compete with our supposedly superior intellect. But the reality written into the modern genome tells a completely different, deeply humbling story. Those primitive dead ends actually provided the biological toolkit that kept Homo sapiens alive. We did not simply outcompete them, we absorbed their strengths. We are walking, breathing mosaics of erased species. The past is not fully gone, and it is not safely buried in the dirt. It survives inside your cells. The great mystery of the ancient world is no longer just how these 6 other human species died, or what catastrophic forces broke their civilizations. The deeper mystery is what they managed to leave inside us before the darkness fell. And as the massive cosmic clock slowly turns, and the warm, deceptive pause of the Holocene inches closer to its inevitable end, we are left to face the final unresolved question. When the climate shifts, the ice inevitably returns, and the Earth resets the timeline once again, will the ghost DNA of the species we forgot be the exact thing that allows us to survive it?